Hi, everyone. It's nice to see you. It's been a long time since we've seen each other. I wanted to continue on with the basic quilting class that we started way back. I don't remember if it was in February or March. And then we had 2 classes and we were shut down. So hopefully if you are continuing on until we can be together again, I wanted to give you some instructions that you can continue on and work on your quilt. One of the first things that we talked about when we were together was the grain of the fabric. I talked about when the fabric is woven, it goes through the loom like this and it creates the straight of the grain. Those are the threads that are anchored, and when the fabric is woven, it's woven cross where the anchor threads, the straight threads, hold it nice and stiff. So you want to use the straight of the grain if you're sewing clothing, if you're doing quilting with large blocks, if you're doing quilting with very tiny blocks, it's not as important, but for what we're doing, it is very important. So when I cut my blocks, I made sure to mark, and you can see I did a pencil mark, on the straight of the grain so I didn't get confused. Now the straight of the grain, if you pull the fabric, it's nice and stiff. If you pull it crossways, there's give to it. And then if you pull the bias, which is the diagonal of the fabric, you see there's a lot of play. But we want to make sure that we're using the straight of the grain. That way all of our pieces are going to hang evenly and one piece won't sag or bag and you'll have an attractive piece. Also, when you're sewing, if you are putting together the straights of the grain, it's going to flow under the presser foot very easily. You'll have a nice finished product. But if you do one in the opposite direction, the one that's cross grain, it's going to pull under the presser foot and you'll probably end up with it being uneven when you get to the bottom. And no matter if you rip it out and try again, if you keep using that cross grain against the straight of the grain, it's going to continue to sag and bag. So you make sure that your cross grains or your straight of the grains are marked. Now, if you have a light colored fabric, such as our cream color fabric, if you're afraid that the marking line, the straight of the grain marking line might show, just put it over on the edge. Remember, we have a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around every block. And if you put just a little pencil mark over here in the seam allowance, no one's going to know. It's just there for you, so you can make your identification so you're sure that you're getting the fabric in the correct direction. Now, I used my 4.5 inch square. Now, I want a finished 4-inch block. So this square is 4.5 inches, allowing for the 4-inch block and then the 1/4 inch that goes all the way around. Then for the big plain block in the center, I used a template that's 12.5 inch square because I wanted a 12-inch finished block. So this is 12.5 inches. Most sewing machines, their presser foot, it's measured from, if you have your needle in the center position, from the center of the presser foot to the outside edge, either direction, it's a 1/4 inch. If you're right-handed or left-handed, that's going to determine how you line your fabric up. So it doesn't make any difference. It's a 1/4 inch from the center to the right, a 1/4 inch from the center to the left. It will be lined up. You'll simply take your presser foot and you're going to run your stitching with the presser foot by the outside edge of the fabric. The needle is lined up in the center and you just continue down your fabric and you have a nice 1/4 inch seam when you're done. I do back stitch both at the beginning and the end of each of my seams. I have had seams before come loose in a quilt, and that's very, very discouraging. So if at all possible, I go ahead and lock it at both ends. String quilting is another kind of quilting that people talk about. And that's where you just have your fabric pieces ready and you just start to feed them through, and you continue to feed it through one continuous strip, and then you cut the blocks apart. Never been able to do it. I don't want to, because I want to be able to lock those stitches at the beginning and the end of each seam. So when I assembled these pieces, I took my rows, and this is what's called a 9-patch quilt block. So I have 9 squares, and I have put them together with my darks in the corners, and then my lights in the center with one dark in the center. This quilt is going to be purple and green. I have many different purples. I have many different greens. So there's going to be a combination. Then my base color, my neutral color, you can't really see, but there's a little floral pattern, and it's a mottled beige and cream color. And so again, it's a floral, so it's going to blend in with the rest of the fabric. So I assembled my 9-inch block, and then I sewed it to my 12.5-inch block. I assembled my rows, and I put all 3 pieces together. And then when I've got all 3 rows done, I pressed all the seam allowances in the same direction on all 3 rows. Now, our change is going to come when we go to assemble the block. We want to alternate our seam allowance. So I'm going to have my seam allowances going in this direction on the top row, and then I'm going to flip my fabric over. So on the second row, the seam allowances go like that. Now, when I put these 2 seams together, because they're going in opposite directions, the seams are going to butt right up against each other, and they like hold each other in place. I still continue though to put pins. I'll put pins on both sides of that seam allowance to hold it nice and taut. And that way I know that when I come along that fabric, I get to the seam or to the seams, I'll pull my pins out. You'll break a needle if you try and go over a pin with your needle. But I pull the pins out and I continue down. That will make the little corners butt up right next to each other, and it will be a nice finished design. When I have that all finished, then I do the pressing. And lots of times you're pressing, when you start to press, the grain of the fabric just kind of takes over, and you say, oh, okay, it will be smoother if I press in the direction that the grain of the fabric is pulling. But you see this one, these seam allowances were pressed up, and these seam allowances were pressed down, simply because that's kind of what the fabric was telling me to do. Also, you try to put the seam allowances toward the darker fabric rather than the lighter fabric. That way you don't run the risk that there might be a darker line of color that shows through. So usually you try and put the darker color on the bottom with the lighter color over it. So I took my 1/4 inch and I made a nice seam allowance. And then again, because I'm trying to get rid of bulk, I pressed my seam over onto the nice flat block. And that way I don't end up with a bunch of bulky seams that are overlapping each other. You try when you're quilting to get rid of as much bulk as you can. Pressing is so important. Pressing is almost as important as the sewing. Let the pressing of the fabric, the ironing of the fabric work for you. If you have pressed your seams flat each step of the way, then they're going to butt up against each other and they're going to make just nice, really smooth, solid seams. Now, I have started on my next row, and I will work on this before I do the next video so that you can see how it's going to look. Now, a lot of people that first night when we were working, they really liked the design on the back of this cover of this book, and this is a modified Irish chain. Now, an Irish chain, a real Irish chain, is done with very, very small squares, and you do rows and rows of little squares. So this is a modified design. It's going to make a very attractive quilt. Also, it goes so much faster because you will assemble one 9-patch, and then you have the plain square in the center, then a 9-patch, the plain square, a 9-patch. Now you notice that they started with a 9-patch, this corner and this corner, plains in between. The next row, they started with the plain, then the 9-patch, then the plain, then the 9-patch, then the plain. It's so easy to assemble. When you're looking at this, you go, oh my goodness, that's going to be really hard to do. And it's not. It's very simple to do. You just have to remember to alternate your blocks. So this is the 9-patch. We will go over sashing and borders. This quilt does not have any sashing in between the blocks. The blocks butt right up against each other. On this quilt, this is a sampler quilt. Excuse me. And you see that there's little strips of fabric that run in between the blocks. Lots of times they're contrasting colors, so they really stand out. This, they chose to do the sashing just in the color of the background color. But on this Irish chain, after they've assembled the squares, then you see that they ran a very narrow cream-colored border, and then a red border, and then a wider cream-colored border. And if you could see more closely, there's red bias around the outside edge of the quilt. So this is like when you're framing a picture and you do the mats for your picture. This would be matting your quilt. And that way your quilt becomes a design, it becomes a picture, just as though you were going to hang it on the wall, and perhaps you would choose to hang yours on the wall. I have many quilts that have hung on the wall. Now, I chose to do each square individually. I watch TV at night. I have a TV tray in front of my chair, and I sit and I cut quilt blocks. To me, it's very relaxing. Some people really don't like cutting quilt blocks, and they want a faster way to do it. A faster way to do it is with a rotary cutter. A rotary cutter is a handle that has a round blade on it, very, very sharp. You have to use a mat that the blade gouges down in, and then it's called a self-healing mat. Once the blade is passed through, magically the mat adheres back to itself. You can use it over and over again. I'm not real comfortable using the rotary cutter. I cut my finger really bad one time. They do make gloves now that you can wear. They also make handles. If you're cutting out a lot of blocks, you might choose to use it. I'll demonstrate the next video and show you how to use it. But you have a wide, clear ruler like this, and you run the blade down along the ruler. This is where I ran into trouble. I got my finger, I was holding the finger really tight like this, and I just ran the blade up my finger, and it cuts very easily. So I like individual blocks, but if you're a zippy person and you want to do a lot of blocks, the Rotary Cutter might be something you really like. A lot of the quilt stores now, when you go to buy quilting fabric, they cut the fabric with a Rotary Cutter rather than scissors. So it's, again, just another technique, and I'll talk about that the next time. Now, what we've done for the library, we have set up an email address that if you have any questions whatsoever, you can just email me and I'll get back to you. Or you can always call on the library telephone, and you can, if you have any questions, I will be more than happy to answer any questions. In the fall, we're going to start a quilting sampler class where each month we will have a different block design. And so that, again, will be done on the computer, since I have no idea when we can be together again in the library. And I will give you the patterns and all the directions each month. But for right now, we're just going to continue with the basic class that we've started. I'm more than happy to answer any questions, so don't hesitate at all. It's just quilting@clinton.lib.mi.us. And I'll check that every single day and go in, and if you have any questions, just let me know if there's anything you would like for me to demonstrate. When I go to sew, it's important when you're choosing your thread to choose a neutral color. Now you're going to say, well, she has cream and she has green and she has purple. Why doesn't she use one of those colors? Well, you would constantly have to be changing your thread. And also it's difficult if you're using purple thread, then when you pull your seam, you're going to see purple against that cream color or green. And it's not a smooth look. So if you use a neutral color, kind of in between the two, then when you pull your threads, all you see is that very neutral look, and it's a very neutral seam. So just choose a neutral color, I would really suggest. If you're doing two darker fabrics though, let's say you're doing a sports team. I ran into this, I did a quilt that was orange and navy for my grandson for his favorite football team. So if you used orange, you pulled it, you saw the orange against the navy. If you used navy, then you saw the navy against the orange. So I ended up using one color on the top and the other color on the bobbin, and that actually helped a lot, and it wasn't so visible when you pulled that seam to see that color. So the next time we're together, I'll show you the Rotary Cutter, and I will show you how to get sashings and borders started. And then the following, we will talk about choosing your backing and your batting and how you are going to quilt your finished project, whether you're going to quilt it yourself on the machine, if you're going to take it to a quilter that has one of the large quilting frame machines, or if you're simply going to tie it. A lot of quilts I have just tied. Some quilts I have done entirely by hand. Plan on a couple of years to get that quilt done, but it does look pretty, and when you're finished you say, I did it 100% by hand. So there's lots of options to come, and I hope this might have helped someone, and I will see you the next time. Have a nice evening. Bye-bye.